my community, not my world, not my child. Then there are those of us who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. You know the feeling you get when it's really cold outside and you slide on your fleece pajamas and your warm slippers? Or when you take that first bite of your favorite home-cooked meal? Or cuddle up in bed and crack the cover of your well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, or whatever your favorite book would be? It feels comfortable, familiar, soothing, and safe. I, like perhaps many of you, get the same feeling the moment that Fred McFeely Rogers, his slow voice, soothing and comforting sound comes from the television speakers. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood first aired February 19, 1968, and ended with its final episode in August of 2001. A show spanning 33 years, filling the homes and hearts of several generations of kids. For those of you that watched Mr. Rogers, or who were in the background as your kids watched Mr. Rogers, you'll remember most, perhaps, aside from his notorious cardigans, which his mother knit, by the way, how the show, and Fred Rogers in specific, made you feel. Feel about yourself, feel about others, feel about the world. He evoked a sense of peace, even in the midst of the most fierce of puppet arguments or meltdowns. He was a calm in the storm. Rogers had been in turns ridiculed, praised, teased, and emulated for decades for his unabashed vulnerability in the midst of a culture that seems to reward aggression and pride. Because of this and who he was, I believe we should regard him like we do the most important religious teachers throughout history. Like them, he was radically countercultural. He was deeply committed to his vision of how the world ought to be and worked each day to see it into existence. His message touched millions of lives. But like many religious leaders, his legacy wasn't fully appreciated until we had to spend time without it. Like some childhood joys, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is a gift that continues to give as we mature. And when we reflect upon it as adults, his lessons become ever more profound. Now, I believe they are particularly relevant to us as Unitarian Universalists, engaged in our own spiritual growth and invested in our health as a larger community. So I'd like to share with you some of the most important lessons from Mr. Rogers. The first, and perhaps the most notorious, is everyone is your neighbor. No matter if you are Spanish or French speaking, cis or transgender, living paycheck to paycheck or the Queen of England, young, old, sober, or struggling with addiction, a wheelchair user or not, you are a neighbor worth caring for. Rogers used the notion of a neighborhood with friendly neighbors as an easily recognizable metaphor for children who would understand neighborhood meant belonging. And since he greeted each of us as his neighbors, it meant that each of us belonged. And as he revealed during an interview once, he also used the term neighbor as a sort of call to action, as a way to ask, if we are all neighbors, what is our responsibility to one another? He said, once you realize that everybody's your neighbor, you have a choice. You can either be an advocate or an accuser. An accuser is somebody who sees only what's awful about themselves. So they look through those eyes and look for what's awful about their neighbor. An advocate is somebody who looks through the eyes of God at their neighbor and sees what's good about that person because they're created in God's likeness. That's a very simple, basic truth, but to live that out in our daily lives is tremendously difficult, he says. Rogers felt that if he could teach that basic truth to young children, then perhaps we had hope as a species, after all, no matter what difficulties we may face together in the future. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood helped young viewers process stress incurred during intense periods of cultural upheaval. When it would have been easy to demonize villains, Rogers instead forced viewers to tussle with a question Jesus himself was asked in the Gospel of Luke: who is my neighbor? While the question felt different depending upon circumstances, Rogers' answer never wavered. His definition of neighbor was whomever you happen to be with at that moment, especially if you are in need. Second lesson is your emotions are important. When Rogers decided to pursue a career in television, it wasn't fame that he was after. While watching TV during seminary, he saw people throwing pies at each other's faces, which he believed was both demeaning behavior and a missed opportunity. In the wake of World War II, thousands of veterans returned from battle and started families. Rogers saw these shell-shocked heroes and worried that their wounds would unintentionally create a generation of emotionally stunted children. Television was a perfect vehicle for teaching kids to cope with life's difficulties and express their feelings. But he felt at that time it was mostly used for mindless entertainment. He set out to provide a different type of educational experience for children that would fill what he saw was a void. As new generations discovered Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, we continue to be a culture fueled by toxic masculinity. A culture in which feeling anything but anger is often considered a weakness, especially for those who identify as male. But as we know, the human experience is a rainbow of emotional experiences, and each of those emotions is natural. And Mr. Rogers was a grown man, encouraging exploration of emotions, exemplifying healthy emotional expressions. As a specialist in child emotional development, Mr. Rogers always emphasized the importance of understanding that every feeling, pain, shame, anger, sadness, was perfectly normal and easier to handle if shared with a friend. Perhaps some of you have seen this clip on YouTube or around, but in a hearing before the Senate to discuss the future of funding public television, he said, "If we could show that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. It is much more dramatic that two men could be working out their feelings of anger than of showing something of gunfire." As further example of his passion for this particular subject matter, he sang in front of a room full of male politicians, and I won't sing this. "What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems wrong and nothing you do seems very right? What do you do? Do you punch a bag or pound some clay or dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you can go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned the thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song." The video ends with the Senate judge saying, "Well, I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned your $20 million. And thank gosh you did. The third lesson is your faith is best shared through your actions. Amy Hollingsworth wrote a book entitled The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers. And in it she shared her story of meeting Rogers and their unfolding conversations about his faith. As many of you know, Mr. Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister. And rather than serving as a chaplain or parish minister, he served, Reverend Rogers. He was charged with evangelizing to children through television, a way he could serve his faith in a broader way that also matched his passion. I love how Hollingsworth sets up her interaction and how transformative the time together was for her. She says, "I really thought, in my narrow-minded way, when I first met him, that I was going to impact his spirituality. In my circle at the time, he didn't use the right words. He didn't use the right vocabulary. He didn't say the phrase born again or saved. Whereas in my circle, people might call God Father God, he called God the Eternal. I really thought, I'm going to get him to be bolder about using some of this terminology. And isn't that always the way? I meet this gentleman, and he's the one who ends up transforming my life. I think I thought I had my faith all figured out, and he reintroduced mystery. Using a term like the Eternal instead of Father God shows that sense of awe and mystery that I think I had lost. So he did very gently nudge me in a different direction. I think he made me less narrow-minded, more tolerant, and more in awe of what's mysterious about my faith. Additionally, Mr. Rogers was a vegetarian, explaining this decision in his classic way, saying, I don't want to eat anything with a mother. He didn't drink or smoke, and by all accounts, he's in a loving relationship with his wife for 50 years. He rarely shared these details with others, not because he thought they were too personal, but like his faith, he simply lived his beliefs, not because of an urgency to convince others of their need to do so, but because he felt compelled to do so himself. In an Atlantic article entitled Saint Fred, I read this quote which sums this up quite nicely. Fred Rogers was an ordained minister, but he was no televangelist, and he never tried to impose his beliefs on anyone. Behind the cardigans, though, was a man of deep faith. Using puppets rather than a pulpit, he preached a message of inherent worth and unconditional lovability to young viewers, encouraging them to express their emotions with honesty. Inherent worth and unconditional lovability. That sounds exceedingly familiar. Our fourth lesson, anything can be sacred if we make it so. During Hollingsworth's interview, she found that Rogers considered the space between the television set and the viewer to be holy ground, and that whatever he said or did on the show could be translated by the Holy Spirit into what the person needed to see or hear. Here's what I gather from that. Even something as mundane as watching television could become ripe for transformation. In fact, everything he did on his show was rather mundane. Taking off and putting on his cardigan, tying his shoes, getting his mail, feeding his fish. These are all everyday, practical tasks. But he does them with intention, with kindness, using his time fruitfully by teaching or reflecting. Think of each of the tasks you have to perform throughout your day. What could you be doing to make those tasks sacred tasks? How could you transform the mundane in your life into sacred? Our fifth and last lesson is, who you are is good enough. Mr. Rogers felt that children were important, but that they were simultaneously being told through various influences in their lives that they were unimportant. This is the reason that he spoke so frankly on his show, talking to children as though they were adults, capable of complex emotions and thoughts. One of Mr. Rogers' most familiar phrases is, I like you just the way you are, or some variation of that. In that same Senate hearing I referenced earlier, Mr. Rogers said, one of the very first things that a child learns in a healthy family is trust. I'm very much concerned about what's being delivered to our children in this country. This is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him or her realize that they are unique. If any of you may wonder whether or not that message was actually being received by his viewers, I offer you this tidbit. Later in his life, Rogers recounted the story of a child who was being abused by his biological parents, who reportedly wouldn't give him a winter blanket and wouldn't give him a bed to sleep in. Through encountering Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, the child began to hope that there were kind people in the world, and became convinced that he too deserved to be treated with respect. The child called an abuse hotline and was rescued. If the story doesn't seem exceptional enough from that alone, consider that the hotline operator who answered the phone adopted the boy. Hollingsworth shared that one of the things that always stood out was how strong he was in being true to who he was. He was the best Fred Rogers that he could have possibly been, and he never wavered from that. He never wavered from just being himself. We UUs have many beliefs that overlap Mr. Rogers, but the lessons I named here are the ones and that we, as most people, can stand to learn again and again. Everyone is your neighbor, and you are responsible to them. Your emotions are important, so don't be afraid to express them. Your faith is best shared through your actions. Or in other words, walk the walk. Anything can be sacred. Each moment of your life is extraordinary and capable of inducing awe. And lastly, who you are is good enough. Be yourself and take pride in your uniqueness. So what is his legacy after spending his entire life in service to children across the world? In the 14 years since he has died, Mr. Rogers' legacy has emerged as the man we seem to turn to when times get difficult. When our world ceases making sense to us and we just don't know what to do with our feelings about it. When we need more than anything those warm pajamas, that meal, or that great book. When we need to feel secure. The world is not always a kind place, Rogers once said. That's something all children learn for themselves, whether we want them to or not. But it's something they really need our help to understand. He has a quote that goes like this, and you've probably heard it. When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You'll always find people who are helping. This quote is exactly what we need to hear during mass shootings and terrorist attacks and hurricanes and wildfires, because it reminds us of the good in people the moment we're ready to give up on them. I've seen Rogers' quote shared across social media more times than I can count in the past few years, making it akin to American folklore, if you will. Hollingsworth shares, when he was initially diagnosed with cancer, his first response was that he couldn't wait to go to heaven. It was part of his theology to believe that people in heaven helped those of us on earth. He really believed that. He believed that his parents and the people he loved, like Henry Nouwen and Johnny Costa, he certainly believed that those people inspired him and helped him. That was part of his thinking, so I'm sure he does help people. I don't think that his goodness and his love for people is limited by where he is in his new neighborhood. Perhaps you, like me, hope that we can be his neighbor again one day. Amen.